5 ट्रिलियन की इकोनॉमी का सपना देख रहा है देश और इस सपने को साकार करने के लिए तैयार है ब्लूप्रिंट। और जिन्होंने इस इकोनॉमी का खाका खींचा है वो है देश के चीफ इकोनॉमिक एडवाइजर डॉक्टर कृष्णमूर्ति सुब्रमण्यम, जिनको चुना है हमने आज का स्वदेश हीरो।
और दशा तय करने का सपना भले ही प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी देखते हों, मगर उनको पूरा करने का खाका उनकी टीम तैयार करती है। और उनकी इस टीम में अहम रोल निभा रहे हैं देश के मुख्य आर्थिक सलाहकार डॉक्टर कृष्णमूर्ति सुब्रमण्यम, जिनकी सोच और समझ ने देश की आर्थिक राह में एक नई इबारत लिखी है। जो आर्थिक नीति, बैंकिंग और कॉरपोरेट प्रशासन के एक एक्सपर्ट हैं और यही वजह है कि इन तमाम सेक्टर में किए गए उनके रिसर्च पर कई लेख भी छप चुके हैं। डॉक्टर सुब्रमण्यम तमिलनाडु के चेन्नई में जन्मे। यहीं से उन्होंने अपनी प्रारंभिक शिक्षा हासिल की और फिर आईआईटी कानपुर से B.tech किया। इसके बाद IIM कोलकाता से MBA में टॉप कर गोल्ड मेडल हासिल किया। वो यूनिवर्सिटी ऑफ शिकागो से फाइनेंशियल इकोनॉमिक में PhD भी कर चुके हैं। बचपन से ही सुब्रमण्यम की पढ़ने लिखने की ललक काफी थी। यही वजह है कि उनके पास ढेरों डिग्रियां हैं। हिंदी, इंग्लिश, तमिल, तेलुगु, बंगाली और संस्कृत भाषाओं में माहिर डॉक्टर सुब्रमण्यम को पढ़ाने लिखाने में भी खासा इंटरेस्ट रहा है। साल 2005 से 2010 तक वो एमरी यूनिवर्सिटी में प्रोफेसर रहे। साल 2010 से 2018 तक उन्होंने इंडियन स्कूल ऑफ बिजनेस में बतौर असिस्टेंट और एसोसिएट प्रोफेसर अपनी सेवाएं दी। देश के मुख्य आर्थिक सलाहकार बनाए जाने के बाद से वो लीव पर चल रहे हैं। देश के सबसे कम उम्र के मुख्य आर्थिक सलाहकार होने का गौरव भी डॉक्टर सुब्रमण्यम को ही जाता है। साल 2019 के इकोनॉमिक सर्वे में डॉक्टर सुब्रमण्यम की बड़ी भूमिका रही। उन्होंने ही देश के लिए 5 ट्रिलियन इकोनॉमी की राह का ब्लूप्रिंट तैयार किया। 2021 के इकोनॉमिक सर्वे में भी उन्होंने काफी अच्छे सुझाव दिए और सरकार द्वारा लागू किए गए कई सुधार डॉक्टर सुब्रमण्यम के विचारों पर ही बेस्ड हैं। इसके अलावा डॉक्टर सुब्रमण्यम बैंकिंग सेक्टर में भी अपना लोहा मनवा चुके हैं और कई बैंकों को अपनी सेवाएं दे चुके हैं। साल 1999 से 2000 तक वो मुंबई में ICICI बैंक में मैनेजर डेरिवेटिव रिसर्च रहे, जबकि 2004-05 में वो न्यूयॉर्क के JP मॉर्गन चेस कंपनी में बतौर सलाहकार काम कर चुके हैं। वहीं 2015 से 2018 तक बंधन बैंक में इंडिपेंडेंट डायरेक्टर और नेशनल इंस्टीट्यूट ऑफ बैंक मैनेजमेंट में डायरेक्टर रह चुके हैं। डॉक्टर सुब्रमण्यम सेबी की स्टैंडिंग कमेटी के वैकल्पिक निवेश नीति, प्राइमरी मार्केट, सेकेंडरी मार्केट और रिसर्च सदस्य के रूप में भी काम कर चुके हैं। पिछले 3 साल में सरकार में मुख्य आर्थिक सलाहकार के रूप में उन्होंने काबिले तारीफ काम किया है और 31 दिसंबर 2021 को उनका ये कार्यकाल खत्म होने जा रहा है। ET नाउ स्वदेश।
वहीं CA KV सुब्रमण्यम से ET नाउ स्वदेश के मैनेजिंग एडिटर निकुंज डालमिया ने 5 ट्रिलियन इकोनॉमी और मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी समेत कई मुद्दों पर एक्सक्लूसिव बातचीत की है। आइए आपको ये पूरी बातचीत सुनाते हैं।
So let me ask you a simple and a straightforward question. When will we become a $5 trillion economy? 2 years, 3 years, 3.5 years?
Nikunj, I think we have to recognize here that every economy, across the world has been impacted by the pandemic. Not only has the pandemic affected economic goals, but it has also created uncertainty. Because as about a month back, most of us were sort of thinking that, maybe the Delta variant would be the last one, and yet now we are actually seeing the Omicron variant. So during such periods of uncertainty, till we, sort of don't see some resolution of this uncertainty, I think it will be very speculative at this point to actually, say anything on that part. But I think there's no question that we will definitely reach there soon.
Couple of closing comments. I'm going to drive to something which is really the most debated topic globally and even in India. What is the future of crypto? Whether it is India or whether it is in the world. And even though some central bankers globally have raised a red flag about cryptocurrency and the existence of cryptocurrency, are you worried about it?
So Nikunj, I think there are a few aspects that we have to take this into account. Do keep in mind that the Honorable Finance Minister has already made a statement on this in Parliament, and therefore whatever I'm saying is only on the conceptual front, which I've said earlier as well. And that is that the distinction needs to be made between crypto as an asset and crypto as a currency. Economics teaches us that when we think about currencies, there are very important considerations that have to come in. Across time, currencies have always been those that have been issued by sovereigns, and that is for good reason, because there has to, I think what really keeps a currency, provides credence to that currency is the fact that the sovereign backs it. So, I think that's something which is, very important to remember. Second point is, when you think about, even crypto as an asset, an important aspect that has to be factored in is that there is no underlying, that is, backing the price of crypto. If you take a stock, for instance, or equity stock, the cash flows of that firm is what is actually, backing for that stock. If you take gold, commodities, there is actually an asset. Unlike that, in crypto, there is nothing, no asset that is backing it, and therefore intrinsic volatility can be very high, which also then impacts the attractiveness of crypto as an asset itself, because historically, again, assets have been those that have actually had typically more stable values and something that is underlying. So that's the second aspect. Third point which we actually must remember is that whenever you take a financial innovation, that is a zero-sum game. In other words, has no benefits for the real sector, or maybe minimal benefits for the real sector, that has to be treaded very cautiously. The example that I use to illustrate this is, tomorrow if you and I, Nikunj, decide to sit and play cards with each other, then what might happen is that money will change hands. Maybe you might become richer at my expense, but collectively the two of us will actually hold the same amount of money that we started with, at the start of the day, and we would have not done no real activity during that time. Real economy would not have benefited anything from that activity that we did. This is what happens with a zero-sum game as well. Money changes hands, but does not necessarily, flow into the real sector. One caveat, that the blockchain that is actually underlying cryptocurrency, it has some, the potential even without crypto itself to actually benefit from the real economy, and that has happened even before the fascination for crypto has caught so much fancy. So I think these are important conceptual aspects that must be remembered, and when you take all that into account, as you can see clearly conceptually, I think it is very clear that unlike those that are in the cryptocurrency world, unlike their claim that crypto is a panacea, it is actually, the truth is somewhere clearly in between.
For the longest time I've interacted with you, you've never commented on the monetary policy, and we've appreciated that. But without getting into a specific on what RBI should do, if I may urge you to just comment on this whole world which central bankers are currently using openly, that inflation is transitory. Is it transitory?
So again, here we should make a distinction between India and the rest of the world. I think in the rest of the world, especially in the advanced economies, I am not sure that inflation there is transitory, because as we discussed earlier, if you only stimulate demand, you do nothing on supply. I think that is Econ 101, something that we learn in our undergraduate studies, that clearly prices will go up and therefore there will be inflation. Unless supply on many of these, commodities and other aspects, unless supply goes up, you will have inflation, in the advanced economies. Here's where India is different. As we were discussing earlier, India actually, had the foresight to see that the COVID pandemic is an important supply side disruption, and therefore we have to actually build for supply. And I mentioned foresight because supply increases do not happen overnight. It takes 2-3 quarters for supply expansion to happen, and therefore foresight is required in being able to see that this is a disruption to supply, and that's something that India did, and that is why our inflation actually is range bound less than 5%. So this is a very important point, together with the point that I mentioned earlier about the proportion of inflation that comes from domestic factors and the factors and the proportion that comes from foreign factors. These are important aspects that must be taken into account when we think about about monetary policy. And here let me mention very clearly that in the real world, you have to think in a dynamic manner. When I say dynamic, in other words, you have to take what will happen over multiple periods. So when fiscal policy actually takes into account that if you do only demand side measures, there will be inflation, and therefore monetary policy will have to unwind that demand, and therefore implement supply side measures as well, so that inflation remains in control. Fiscal policy then provides scope for monetary policy and fiscal policy to be supportive. In contrast, in the advanced economies and many of the other emerging economies except India, that aspect has not been taken into account, and therefore they will all now will have to actually go into the phase where, because demand has been stimulated by fiscal policy that has led to inflation, monetary policy has to unwind that, and so rate hikes, etc., have to happen in these economies. But here India has been different, and that difference is something that must be therefore factored in when we think about this aspect.